You have the same system you had 30 years ago. So you have to modernize it. Interest rates, average interest rates for credit here in Brazil are more than 10 times than in Chile, that has a higher credit to GDP ratio. So what you have to do, take all that inflationary rubbish, indexation, the way you tax, short term.
I'll talk now to Roberto Luis Troster. He's an economist here in Brazil and wrote a very interesting article in a famous economic newspaper here in Brazil called Inflationary Rubbish. Please, Troster, explain to us, what is this problem here in the country?
Well, credit to GDP ratio in Brazil is low. Interest rates charged on clients are among the highest, if not the highest in the world. Delinquency rates are very high. 1 in every 2 companies and 1 in every 3 citizens have negative credit bureau records. And why does that happen? Brazil had very high inflation during the 80s and the 90s, especially the last years. Inflation rates got to be 2% per day. Interest rates at the time, the basic interest rate rose up to 12,000% a year. What happened? You had the focus of the inflationary of the financial intermediation was to preserve the national currency. With so high rates of inflation, how did they do it? They had a system that was they had a time span of 1 day. You would buy and sell bonds. You would get credit. Very short periods. And deposits were made also, that deposits would be credited 1 day after. So that kept liquidity. You had a very good compensation system in the country for payments and receivables. And you had to have high rates, but the important thing was to preserve the national currency. It's an example of those days that a company, supermarket, could buy any good for 8 reais, sell it for 7 and profit. And you would ask me, how is that? You buy it for 8, sell it for 7 at a lower price and you profit? Yes, because they would have like 30 days spent to pay the merchandise. So they would buy it, sell it immediately, put the money in the financial market, and the interest rates would compensate the lower price. What happens? In 1st of July 1994, you made a transition from the inflationary currency to a stable currency. This year, the expected inflation is somewhere between 3 and 3.5%. Some days, for 1 year, we're going to have the inflation, a lower inflation that you had for 2 days in a row in those days. But what happens? You change the currency, you stabilize inflation, but you didn't change the financial system. So what happens? Today in Brazil, you make a deposit today in the bank, and as from tomorrow, you start already earning interest. What happens with that? If banks capture short-term deposits, with high liquidity, they can only lend for short terms also. Second, indexes currency. What happens when you have the currency, the deposits indexes? When interest rates go up or inflation go up, what happens? You have what's called a perverse wealth effect. Because imagine the central bank raises interest rates. People that earn interest, what happens? They're going to earn more. So their income is going to increase, is going to spend more instead of spending less. And on the other end, credit takers, their debt will rise more, and it didn't depend on anything they did. So it's a very distorted system. And also you have a problem of coordination. What happens? You raise your rates. No? Now you're having a recession, finishing a recession in the country. So delinquency rates are high. What's the logical thing for every bank, individual bank to do? Raise more the rates, shorten the credit, and level up the standards of credit giving. If all the banks do that at the same time, that comes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's what you have now. 1 in 2 companies and 1 in 3 citizens that have negative credit rates. Total credit, in spite of the high rates, is shrinking. That means that you're transferring wealth from the non-financial sector to amortize debts and interest. So, and taxing, at the time, credit, when you had credit, you had profits because the value of the debt would shrink. So you taxed a lot credit, your central bank had a lot of liquidity, and you're not changing that. You have the same system you had 30 years ago. So you have to modernize it. Interest rates, average interest rates for credit here in Brazil are more than 10 times than in Chile, that has a higher credit to GDP ratio. So what you have to do, take all that inflationary rubbish, indexation, the way you tax, short term, change that. Changing that, you can have a more stable system and a system that's consistent with the dynamics of the economic system.
Troster, do you think nowadays Brazilian government is able to do the necessary changes in the financial system?
Yes, it only depends on the central government. I think the most difficult barrier is convincing bankers, and including the central bank, that you have to change. That if you look at the profit return on equity of the Brazilian financial system, it's lowering. And it's below its average with other countries. Legitimacy of the system is very low. People criticize banks every day. In the last election, they call them son of, I don't remember what. They're very criticized. So, but if they are not convinced that they can have a system like you have in other countries, like you have in Switzerland, that they're going to profit more, they're going to have more credit, more legitimacy, and they're going to help the country grow. At this moment, it's very important to wake up and see Brazil can do better than what it's doing.
I said that because we see government has a priority to be free of all corruption investigations. And we don't see so many measures to the economy in the country.
Yes, it's very sad. I mean, people, first, the agenda is very, very, very narrow. They're talking about a social retirement, a social security amendment reform that only takes care of the private sector, forgetting the public sector, that is where the big deficit is, and a labor reform that just touches some issues of the private sector, forgetting what's happening to the public sector, where the problems lie. Third, you're talking about a fiscal adjustment. The speech is, no, we're going to adjust, but they're spending more on public salaries, keeping public employment, and you have over 14 million Brazilians unemployed looking for jobs. If you would put them, all of them, with open arms side by side, they would cover the whole shore of Brazil and all the frontiers with 9 countries doing that. It's incredible that we're living that. You could first start. You need what we call an administrative reform, how the government operates. Some of the things go back to the empire. You have to change that. Taxing, you have over 50 taxes in Brazil. You can lower the number of taxes, simplify that. A judicial system here in Brazil, it's one of the most expensive in the world, and some trials take decades to be solved. So there are many things you can do that don't depend on the politics. But the private sector, every sector wants to remain the way it is. Just one example. Industry, what does it want? Low credit, just for them. They don't understand that credit has something that's called externality. What's an externality? Suppose you smoke No? What happens? The smoke, I'll have to inhale. It's a negative externality that I have. With credit, it happens the same thing. If some people get credit free and cheap and the rest don't get it, the problem remains. They can't buy, they can't finance, so you have to have that. For all the companies, all they want is devaluation. A devaluation in practice is to lower the real salary of workers instead of focusing on competitive integration with other countries. The same claims they're making now were the same they were making 30 years ago. So we have to modernize. I think the most difficult barrier here in Brazil today is the mentality of entrepreneurs as a whole. There are some exceptions and very good exceptions. Seeing that it's possible. Brazil has all the potential. It has natural resources, people, climate, openness, everything you need to grow, you have it in the country. But you have to change the way you manage the country.
Do you think even meanwhile this extreme political crisis, the economic team has power to do something?
It has the power, but it doesn't have the will. This economic team, it has the power. It has some players are very good, like Paulo Rabelo, Maria Silvia left the government, but a top economist, Marcelo of the Social Security. You have some very good players, that's no question. But they lack ambition. You know, they're blind for some things. People talk about the public deficit, the external deficit. I think there is an ambition deficit in Brazil. They don't have the guts to change. To see that Brazil changing, it can achieve a lot, and it will the moment it starts achieving. Citizens, as a rule, say, "Well, who's going to lead the country?" Instead of that's the wrong question. The right question is, what type of economic program we will have to make the country grow? That should be the question. That should be the quest for the country.
Roberto Luis Troster, thank you so much again for joining us here in Dukascopy TV.
Thank you for the interview, and that's it.
Thank you. Luciane Miranda to Dukascopy TV.